It's wonderful. Yes, not surprising. Good evening, everybody. My name's Allister Heath from the Telegraph, and thank you all for joining us tonight, both the audience here in the room before me, and also to everyone watching on the live stream. Class. It's the age-old British obsession. But traditional categories below or above stairs, upper, middle or lower class, being privately or state-educated, speaking in RP and other traditional accents no longer quite capture the nuances of modern life. For this reason, earlier this year, the Telegraph partnered with the opinion research firm Public First on a class survey asking 13,000 people a series of questions that, when analysed, paint a picture of Britain in 2026 and redefines the class system. Tonight, James Frayne, founding partner of the research agency Public First, a brilliant political strategist and somebody I have known for 20 years, will explain the details of the class survey. He will share what the research for the class tool found and why it matters, and how, in his experience, class plays a significant role in Britain, both in the minds of voters and those who govern them. Then we will be joined on stage by our esteemed panel for a lively debate. Does class remain a defining force in shaping opportunities, identities, and inequalities in modern society? Or has it been eclipsed by other factors such as cultural power, identity politics, immigration, or economic shifts? So thank you to our attendees who have already submitted their questions for me to pose to the panel. And please do continue to submit them. You can scan the QR code displayed on the screen now, behind me, with any camera phone to submit your questions. I will incorporate as many of your questions as possible into my friendly grilling throughout the evening. I am now delighted to say that we have 5 brilliant panelists joining me who each hold distinctive views on this topic. We have Poppy Coburn, who is Associate Comment Editor at The Telegraph, a member of Generation Z, that means she's born in the 21st century, and a rising star in British journalism. She's a brilliant editor, writer, and broadcaster. We have Charles Moore, former editor of the Daily Telegraph, the Sunday Telegraph, and The Spectator, author of must-read, unmissable columns, a member of the House of Lords, and an old Etonian. Suzanne Moore, an award-winning columnist at The Telegraph, a voice of the sensible left, and a leading advocate for women's issues. She left school at 16 and went back to college in her 20s as a single mother. We have Michael Gove, editor of The Spectator, former cabinet minister, one of the fathers of Brexit, the man who saved British state schools, and a great champion of social mobility through education. And of course we have James Frayne, founding partner of Public First and one of the UK's very best political strategists. It's a superb panel and one that will enlighten us tonight. It is now time for the panelists to join me. Please put your hands together and welcome them to the stage. Before we get into the main panel debate, I'm delighted to invite James Frayne to the lectern to explain the details of his brilliant new analysis of class in 21st century Britain. James.
Thank you, Alistair, and evening, everybody. I was wondering for the first sort of half an hour when I arrived why everyone else's picture was in colour and mine was in grey. And then I realised, actually, I'm about to just dump a whole load of numbers and data on you, and so with that in mind, here's the grey man. So let's start by imagining what we think a member of the British upper class looks like. So we probably imagine them as white, male, certainly older. We probably imagine them as being over 50. We probably imagine them in being in one of the sort of old established professions, be it banking or law, perhaps even the civil service. That's what we might immediately think of. But then when we actually consider that and pinch ourselves a bit, we know that the British class system doesn't look like that anymore. We know that there have been such enormous changes in British society and in the British economy over the course of the last 20 years, that the British class system that we all sort of grew up with doesn't hold true anymore. There are far more graduates in the economy and in society than there used to be. There's far more women in the workplace than there used to be at all levels, running businesses, doing part-time work right across the economy. And similarly, there's also large numbers of ethnic minority business people that are running top companies, and again, that are working right throughout the economy. And I think it's for this reason that people in the political world, so in my sort of world, have tended to write class off a bit, as if it no longer really matters, and as if there are other much bigger forces which are defining British politics, be that ethnicity, gender, age, educational attainment. And I think too many people have written class off as being a sort of defining issue. Because if we think about what only happened, let's say, where are we now, a couple of years ago, we saw the demise of Rishi Sunak, which was very heavily influenced by class. So yes, he inherited a discredited Conservative Party. Yes, the economy was weak. But I remember running focus groups at the time when Rishi took power in the Conservative Party, became Prime Minister during a cost of living crisis. There was an instant dislike from the public. You know, they looked at his fancy clothes, his posh trainers, his rich family, his multiple posh residences, and they decided he's not for us and he's not like us. And this wasn't to do with him, well, let me put this in a different way. People thought of him as being part of the upper class. So even though he didn't have that conventional background of being older, being white, having established money, nonetheless people looked at him and thought, as I said, he's a member of the upper class, he's just another posh Tory. But also, the reason I think class is still relevant is when you ask people about their own identity, and I put myself in this camp, people still talk about class. So, if you look at someone like Keir Starmer, he's always talking about his working class credentials, son of a toolmaker, etc. But right across the country, when you ask people about their background, they will often amplify their working class status, and they think that class is part of their identity. So, yes, the class system has changed, but it's still relevant. And this is why the Telegraph, working with the agency that I founded and used to chair, Public First, came up with a new class calculator to bring the class system up to date, if you like. So the central contention from the research was that class is partly conferred upon you. You can't just say, I'm working class, or I'm upper class, or I'm middle class. To some extent, your status as a middle class or a working class person or whatever is conferred upon you by the judgment of others. And therefore, a lot of the research from the big poll that Public First did was about, here are a bunch of characteristics. Do you think this person will be upper class, middle class, etc.? And the poll also included large numbers of questions about one's perceptions of one's own class, if you like. So, Public First came up with 6 distinct classes. These are the ones that you'll have been sort of allocated into yourselves after having done the tool. So at the least affluent end of the scale, you've got the left behind and the dreamers. So the left behind are your more likely, effectively your sort of poorer working class voters, more likely to be in less affluent provincial towns, perhaps in sort of less smart suburbs of bigger cities, not very likely to have much formal education, likely to work in slightly precarious jobs like retail. As it were, above them in scale, you've got the dreamers that are also working class, but tend to be more urban, younger, more likely to live in city centres, more likely to come from an ethnic minority, more likely to have higher levels of education, certainly have more cultural capital, which is something we can talk about. So a bit more sort of culturally plugged in, but don't have any wealth, if you like, don't have much finances, certainly don't own their own homes, probably don't even have a mortgage for that matter. In the middle, you've got your just about managing, and you've got your quietly comfortable. Your just about managing are, again, more likely to live in sort of pretty ordinary suburbs and small towns, more likely to work or have worked in manual jobs. Your quietly comfortable are more likely to have wealth, more likely to have worked in the service sector, more likely to live in sort of smarter suburbs, and these sorts of things. And then at the top of the scale, you have got your ambitious high earners, and at the very top, you have got your elite. So both groups tend to be younger than we might imagine. Again, I started with this contention that we might all think of someone in the elite as being older, white, male. This doesn't hold true for these two groups. As I say, they're quite often quite heavily ethnic minority. They are, as I say, they're younger. They tend to live in urban areas. The differences really are that your elite high earners don't have the wealth that your elites might have. They don't have the same investments. They may work in the public sector as well as the private sector, and your elites are much likely to be business owners, work in the private sector, and the sorts of people that you might see passing through Heathrow, heading towards the sort of first-class departure lounges, etc. So, to finish, we've all spent our lives talking about the British class system. We talk in shorthand about upper class, middle class, working class, and all the rest of it. We might continue to talk in that shorthand, but I think what this tool has done, that Public Affairs have done with the Telegraph, is just create a class system which is just a bit more realistic. Now, it might take us a bit longer for us all to start using these terms as shorthand, but it's certainly a much more realistic reflection of the class system, which, as I said, I think still very much exists and influences British society. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. That was a brilliant analysis and a very interesting lecture. Thank you. Before I turn to my guests to hear their views, I want to hear from you, our audience here and at home with your views. Do you think class still rules Britain? Please take part in our live poll via the QR code displayed now on screen. So just take your phones and I will come back to you again for your view in another poll once the debate has finished, to see if your views have changed, if the speakers have swayed your views at all. So for now, if you scan the code with your camera and your camera phone, you'll see a quick poll to answer. If you have already opened the app to submit your panel questions, you can simply move to the poll area using the simple toggle button at the top of your screen. So I will just wait for a few seconds while people respond. Let's take a look at this for a second. Okay. Right, so, 64%, 63% say yes, is declining. It's 62 to 38% at the moment, which is quite interesting because I thought more people would say yes, to be honest. 62. It's live, it's changing. I think we've got quite a few people on the live feed also responding, which is great. Let's give it another few seconds to see if it stabilizes. I think we have an equilibrium, a solution. Let's see if it changes as the evening progresses. Right, I think it's about time we heard from our panelists and started this discussion. I'd like to say, first of all, that almost 250,000 Telegraph readers have taken the class calculator test over the last few weeks, a truly staggering number of people, including each of the panelists here on stage. James, you'd be happy to hear that I did the test, and guess what? To my great delight, I'm not part of the elite, which was exactly what I wanted to hear. I gamed it a little bit, but not too much. So I think my problem, or what saved me rather, was that I had the wrong kind of cultural capital. I read too many books on economics and about Middle East history, and I don't go to the theatre to watch left-wing plays. I don't belong to a club. I'm more into Coke Zero than red wine, I think, also, which maybe was a bit of a problem. But anyway, as a suburban man, that suits me fine. I have to say I am over the moon. So I'm now going to start off with a round of quick-fire questions for our panelists. I'm going to ask everybody to tell us how they fared in James Frain's survey. Where did you fit? What class are you? Let's start with Michael Gove. Michael, you famously, and in my view convincingly, dismissed the acronymed expert class and have promoted social mobility in education. But I assume that as a member of the House of Lords, you do belong to the elite.
Well, when I filled in the form, which I enjoyed doing, I had assumed that this was a form of developed vetting, and that the result would never be published. But under duress, because naturally, whenever any peer is now appointed to any public position of importance, like being on a Telegraph panel or ambassador to Washington, everything has to be revealed. I am afraid you are absolutely right. I'm guilty as charged. I came out stonkingly, I'm afraid, as a member of the elite.
Well, there you go. And Charles, what about you? Did the fact that you went to Eton guarantee you a coveted slot as a member of the new elite, or did it count against you?
I'm just trying to remind myself of the categories. I read through with great interest what they were, and I answered the quiz, but then it asked me to submit and to test what I was. And I suddenly thought, these data are going to be used to sell me things, so I refused to submit. So I don't know what I am according to the... But I look at these categories, left behind, dreamers, just about managing, quietly comfortable, ambitious high earners, and the elite. And I think, you see, I'm quite old, I'm nearly 70, and so the categories don't quite apply to me. I think I can probably... I quite like the ambitious high earners, but I would put myself now in the category of being an unambitious high earner.
Suzanne, your turn. What were your results?
Well, I got quietly comfortable, and I hated both those words. I don't want to be quiet, and I don't feel comfortable, and so I kept trying to game it. I kept trying to give different answers, and it was especially around the cultural capital thing that I think I fell down, because it was the definition of opera, ballet, and theatre being high cultural capital. I don't think that.
Do you play tennis? Do you play golf?
Of course I don't.
So there you go.
Of course I don't. And I also felt that it was quite skewed towards these, certain kind of golf club type situations. So I didn't fit in, and I wanted to. It's a question of self-ID, some of this, isn't it? So, I've changed class, and I know that in my life. So,
well, that's very interesting in itself, and something I think we will return to. Yeah. So, Poppy, if I were a Marxist, I would assume that you're a member of the Essex petite bourgeoisie. Am I right? Whatever that means in this new system.
Yeah, unfortunately, that wasn't a category. I mean, in your introduction for me, you pointed out that I am just about still a young person. So I was really surprised when I got the quietly comfortable class. It's a picture of someone with grey hair. The class is apparently made up of people who are in their 70s and 80s, and my favourite hobby is supposed to be gardening. I don't know if this just suggests I don't get out enough, but I was somewhat surprised to be placed in that class. But I feel that perhaps because I am younger, I'm still travelling through the classes. I hope that one day I'll end up like you, Michael, at the very top of the totem pole. But who knows? Yes. There's time to slide back down as well. Well,
yes, plenty of time. Okay, well, thanks for that. I'm now going to ask the audience in turn various questions just to kickstart a conversation, and then various people will join in and we'll have a bit of a discussion. And I think I'm going to start with Michael. I think ultimately, the fundamental question is this. Does class still rule Britain, or do we now live in a meritocracy? What do you think?
I don't think we do properly live in a meritocracy. I think that it's still the case that the wealth and the cultural capital that your parents have still play too much of a role in determining what your fate and future will be. I'd like to think that the situation has got better, but one of the things that one has to set our current debate against are the broader economic factors about which you write so brilliantly every week. Because if you have an economic system, as we have had, for the past nearly 2 decades, where you've got low growth, low productivity, and so on, then it is very difficult to have the type of social mobility that one would want to see. And then when you ally that with the fact that those who have property, homes in particular, have seen the values increase and the difficulty for younger people getting on the housing ladder has grown, that's a problem. Then, while obviously I could talk forever about the things that I tried to do when I was Education Secretary, one of the other challenges is that one of the traditional routes towards social mobility is university. And the danger now for our society is that many people of talent will be put off going to university because of the sheer cost attendant on the student loan system. So these are all factors which work against us being a truly meritocratic society.
Yeah, I mean, there's a very interesting point here, which is, can you be a meritocracy if you have a zero-sum game society and a zero-growth economy? Is it possible? Or do you just end up seeing people fighting each other and, everyone trying to grab the same...
I think that it not only is meritocracy more difficult, it also encourages, as you've pointed out and others have pointed out, tribalism. Because exactly as you say, rather than thinking that, to use the cliche, a rising tide lifts all boats and that there's greater fluidity, we tend to be more tribal, and we tend to think, rather than growing the cake, that we want to grab a larger slice. And that's why you get, for example, irrespective of anyone's views on the question, you get a greater degree of worry about migration in times when there are economic difficulties, because people worry that a limited stock of social housing or a limited stock of jobs will go to new entrants rather than those who've contributed.
Susan, what do you think about that? Do you think we live in a meritocracy, or do you think we are still a class-ridden society with massive barriers?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say it's more than class. I'd say it's caste, because class implies you can change. And I think it's so difficult now for people to move on. I agree with a lot of what Michael just said. It's about property, it's about inheritance, it's about the system of hereditary privilege. And the things that enabled me to change class, education, are no longer a way out. This is why we have a whole number of what they call pissed off graduates who are all going to vote Green in the next election, because they were sold something that we are not able to, they're all they've all got MAs in international relations and they're working in the pub. So education is no longer a way out. All the things that gave me a way out, social housing, childcare, those things are now very, very difficult for people. So no, I think class actually, the older I get, the more I think that class has determined my life rather than less.
I see. And Charles, I remember you writing a column after the financial crisis. It was a number of years ago, but it was a very memorable column, where you basically said the economic system has stopped working. Do you think that the kind of economy we have is truly leading even maybe to more social downward mobility rather than upward mobility? Do you think the elevator has stopped?
I think it has rather stopped. If you think of the things of the history of the 20th century, what you would see is a gradual move upwards of most people. And this would be exemplified by everyone getting the vote, which they didn't have until the 20th century, and by economic, by wealth growing quite well distributed, and by education. And those things are all, to some extent, fractured. Well, the vote isn't fractured, but you can tell that people used to be very proud and excited that they got the vote, and now they're not particularly, and therefore the turnout is low. So it's as if the vote doesn't matter, and in the case of economic growth, it's really hardly happened for about 20 years now. And with education, I would put forward the rather controversial view that in order to improve education, you must, oddly enough, have an idea of an elite. That's to say, you must have the idea of aiming high. All societies at all times have elites. The question is not, do you get rid of elites? It's how porous are they? How open are they to new people? Or do they just hold themselves tight? And we had a particularly good system of education in this country, which we destroyed largely, which was the grammar schools. So what happened with the grammar schools was that it's the only time in our history where the grammar schools was when the grammar schools competed pretty successfully with the independent schools. And so you could start with nothing, and you could actually get into the best universities from a grammar school, and you would be just as good or better than a lot of the independent school pupils. And that really doesn't happen now, and that has the strange effect that the universities are actually lowering their standards. So instead of opening up and trying and make everyone try harder, it's all done on almost on class quotas now. I saw the Royal Academy of Music this week announced that it was not going to accept any pupils from private schools. That's a most extraordinary idea, that you would have a sort of discrimination. If you look openly for the best, you will find it from the widest number of people, and that's an encouragement to everybody.
Michael, I'll ask you just to jump in very briefly there before I turn to Poppy. What's your view about the connection between grammar schools, their demise, and social mobility?
I think that in the 50s and 60s, grammar schools did play the role that Charles describes, but I think that over time their success meant that actually we found that, for want of a better word, middle class or wealthier parents cottoned on to the benefits that came from a grammar school education. So the system, the 11+ system, was increasingly gamed by the wealthier, tutoring, preparation for it. And also it was the case that, curiously enough, it was one of the ironies was that, as Charles has noted in his history of Margaret Thatcher's time as Conservative Education Secretary and leader, even as the middle classes were gaming the system, so those middle classes who were locked out became more resentful of the fact that they couldn't get their children into grammar schools. I hope that some of the changes that we brought in during the coalition years and thereafter have created something of the spirit that grammar schools had, without the necessary exclusivity of the 11+. And one of the things that I always used to quote, and my apologies to Charles for this, when I started out as Education Secretary, is that in the year that I started out, the number of boys from Eton, forgive me, who went to Oxbridge was greater than the entire number of children eligible for free school meals who went to Oxbridge. Now, going to the Oxbridge is not the be-all and end-all. There are many children in families that face tough times that weren't eligible for free school meals, but we're talking about 15% of the population being outdone by one school. Now it is the case that many more children from poorer backgrounds go to top universities as a result of the changes that we made and the establishment of free schools, like, for example, the Harris Westminster School just down the road, which has a sort of grammar school ethos without the exclusivity of the past, but there's still a long way to go.
Thank you. And Poppy, what's your view on education and social mobility? Do you think education is still a route to social mobility, or do you think it's something you have to do? You have to go to university, you have to spend 3, 4, 5 years, and in reality, it doesn't really add much?
I mean, I suppose I could directly respond to you, Michael, because I've experienced a bit of both. I've been to a comprehensive school for secondary school. I would say that it did not have a culture of academic excellence for all of the hard work your government did try and do to improve things, which is why I went to a grammar school for sixth form. I applied and got in, and that was a culture of academic excellence. And I was lucky enough to then go to Cambridge, so I have leapfrogged through education towards what should have been an elite institution. I think you also made a point about the middle classes, getting somewhat upset when their own children didn't get into grammar schools. And that's really what a meritocracy means. It's like a ladder. David Cameron once used the metaphor of a ladder. That's what a meritocracy is. You climb up. But what he neglected to say is that if the meritocracy is going to work, people are going to have to climb down as well. And we do not like that happening in this country. If people have assets, if they have wealth, they can hold on to that money. They can hold on to their class position in society. there has been very limited growth for about 30 years. The entire time I've been alive, really, there's been stagnant wage growth. There's a very limited number of jobs in society that would allow someone, at least through income alone, to move up into a higher class background. And the people that have those jobs hold on to them for dear life. They have very sharp elbows. It is very difficult to better yourself through the traditional educational route. I think there was a moment where we peaked as a country in terms of how close we got to meritocracy. It wasn't perfect, but it was in the 20th century. I think even the life of someone like Keir Starmer exemplifies that quite well. You know, he is a true climber. He's moved up from humble beginnings to being literally, well...
And he's about to move down.
In theory, the most powerful man. In theory, the most powerful man in Britain.
Yeah.
He doesn't look like it, does he?
Well, no.
But I don't think that society exists anymore. You know, without economic growth, there is going to be a very limited number of jobs that people find attractive, that are high-paying, that are high status. And so you will see people become downwardly mobile, not through choice. So 50% of the population now goes to university. When they graduate and they can't get a high-paying job, they can't get a job that they feel proud of, what do you think happens to those people? What do they do? What do they think about the society that they live in?
Well, there's a concept known as surplus elites. And when you live in a society with surplus elites, an over-provision of graduates, perhaps, given the number of graduate jobs, or you know, a large number of people who believe that they are entitled to certain elite positions, but the elite positions don't exist, then you often have social turmoil and, you know, the threat of some sort of disorder and disarray. And it's quite possible that the West is moving ever closer to that kind of moment. So, Charles, I'm going to ask a slightly more provocative question, which is, is there anything we should miss about the old class system? And you know, should we feel sorry for white middle-class men?
Well, as a white middle-class man, of course, I want everyone to feel sorry for me, so that's clear. I think when a class, every society at all times has some sort of class system. There will be some virtues in that, in the sense that certain traditions will grow up, which have a sort of solidarity. And so, for example, one of the big things that's missing in modern life is working class solidarity. That was one of the sort of the great supporting aspect of what in some ways was a disadvantage of being working class, was that you were part, well, first of all, you were working, which now we have a very large unworking poor class. And so when you had much more pride in manual labor, this is obviously bound to change in modern times, but nevertheless it was an impressive thing. And so in that sort of system, which had a hierarchy, it wasn't all bad. And similarly, I think the traditions that each class might have, like the professional tradition, for example, you know, solicitors, doctors, that sort of thing, is of great value. So you need to be a bit careful when you try to dismantle a class system, because you can actually cause more hatred than existed before. The other thing I just say is, very quickly, is one thing I do like about class is it's an endless source of humor. And there must be so many jokes about it in every form, and on television and film and everything. And I just would be sorry if those could no longer be recognized and laughed at anymore.
I suppose there could be a new form of humor, poking fun at, you know, the various categories that James has created, you know, the new elites that go skiing and, you know, the whatever they're called. You know, so I suppose one kind of, I mean, as you say, every society has a class system. The question is which class system. You know, do you have an American-style class system which, you know, is partly only about money, but now is becoming a bit more European as the American left becomes more kind of socialistic, and you got a French class system, and which is semi-meritocratic, I suppose. But Suzanne, what's your view? Do you think, for example, that the demise of the old working class as part of this move to not so much towards a classless society, but a new form of class within society, do you see costs to that as well as benefits?
Well, I think there's undoubtedly been costs. I mean, you know, the last civil war was a miners' strike, wasn't it? So, yes, of course, I think there's been costs. And we can all go to parts of the country where we see what deindustrialization did. So, yeah. But I also don't want to romanticize some of that working class culture, because some of it was pretty bad. You know, I think we can be nostalgic for something that was really not very good for a lot of people a lot of the time. And you know, when I was growing up, for instance, the idea of my mother used to say, "Oh, she keeps reading, so she must be depressed." You know, I mean, you know, that sort of very anti kind of book kind of culture. I mean, I would read it. You know, I think probably it's the same for you, Michael. I mean, I think my generation is one of the last sort of socially mobile generations, and because I wanted to read everything, including, you know, the back of a cornflakes packet, because that's what some working class kids are like. And I was then sort of given some chances, but I didn't even know about university. I remember walking out of school when I was 16, because I always wanted to do my own thing, and they said, "Well, we thought you might go to Cambridge." And I said, "But I've been to Cambridge because I went to a gig there." I didn't even know what that was. I think people now are much more. They are aspirational, and that's good. I mean, I think we have to encourage the aspiration, but we have to push the levers by which people can achieve that. I mean, I think I would be the elite if I hadn't had children, but I have to sort my children out, you know, and to live in London is, everybody knows, it's just almost impossible.
Michael, what do you think the impact of the smartphone and the move towards a more visual society would be on social mobility? Because, I mean, that's a revolution that we don't speak of enough, right? A total collapse in reading among younger people, you know, especially teenagers onwards. You know, the primacy of the image, of the short video and all that kind of stuff.
Yes, I think it offers a new route, in a way, for some people to transcend a background of relative disadvantage, because if you're glamorous and self-confident, then you can become the influencer or the reality TV star in a way that would have, you know, there would have been that route in the past, but it would have been more difficult for a particular set of skills. Similarly, it's now the case, and this has been the case for years now, that there are people who can become millionaires by using YouTube to explain how good they are at playing computer games. So,
or opening packets of cornflakes or something.
Or whatever it might be. So there are a group, again, I'm showing my age, called the Sidemen, some of you may have heard of, who have achieved both celebrity and riches on the basis of explaining to lots of other teenage boys how to play a particular football computer game called FIFA. So it's a route to wealth.
But I just worry that the premium on looks and on glamour and on having an extrovert personality and so on, or just becoming larger and larger and larger.
I think that's true, but then I think the other thing is that there have always been routes like that in the past. So if we go back to Roman times, then some of the people who would have been, who are on Love Island now, would have been gladiators then, if they were men, and some of the women would have been the mistresses of senators. So, you know, the means by which strength, beauty, front, chutzpah can carry people forward may change, but all of those qualities, I think, are there. But I, like Suzanne, would prefer a world in which bookishness and a particular type of exam-passing curiosity were a more reliable route up the social scale than your capacity to curate the perfect Instagram feed. But one has to be realistic about human nature. Can
I just come in on this about what expectations are, because that makes a lot of difference to class. And one of the things that I do think is depressing about nowadays is how low the expectations of how well uneducated people can be educated. So when, and actually this was, and Michael was perhaps the only modern minister of either party that really moved this for the better. But I remember saying to a Conservative Minister of Education before Michael, I got hold of the exam papers that children did when they were 13 in 1890. And I showed them to him, and they were about 10 times more difficult than the ones that were, these were poor children who were going to leave school at 14, but much more was expected of them. And that's extraordinary that we've somehow lost that. I think because sometimes because we're embarrassed about thinking of ourselves as elitist, we think we have to dumb it down. And actually, if you have confidence, and I'll just make a comparison, people have dumbed down our universities, but there's other types of excellence they never dumb down. So nobody would think of saying Manchester United and Liverpool are too good as football teams. They're too elite. So let's make them worse so we can have a whole load of bad players there who will then get more opportunity. They would want a ladder of opportunity. Sport would be a ladder of opportunity, and the beacons of excellence would encourage everybody else. And that concept has weakened.
Yeah.
And Poppy, what's your view on the tyranny of low expectations? Do you think that's dragging down social mobility and reinforcing the class system?
I mean, it's absolutely true. I mean, it wasn't that long ago that I was doing my GCSE exams, and I'm sure you could all pass this in the audience with flying colours. It's basically a memory test.
Yeah.
But I don't think that's a problem necessarily that's come from the internet. I think it is much older. The truth is we've had an anti-intellectual bent to our culture for decades and decades now. I mean, going back to Keir Starmer again, when he was interviewed on Desert Island Disc, he was asked, what was your favourite book? And he said he didn't have one.
Yes.
You know,
Well, that's better than one politician who famously invented a book that didn't exist when I asked him that question.
But then someone asked him, you know, what's your favourite song? Oh, I don't have one. I mean, we're supposed to believe this man doesn't dream, that he's just a robot that unpowers at night. But I think that comes from the fact, for a certain generation of people, the only thing they were allowed to publicly acknowledge as something they enjoyed was football. David Cameron had to do the same thing. I think he made up a football team that he had supported. But I don't think that's got something to do with the internet. I actually think the internet is a tool for liberating yourself if you're using it in a certain way. We hear a lot about the age of illiteracy. I actually think people are hyper-literate. You're literally always reading words. You're just reading a lot of stupid words. And this kind of comes back to what you said, Charles, about elitism. You actually need some kind of curation. You need to have some kind of canon that you can refer to. And we've gone so far away from being able to say this is objectively better than that, that people feel that they don't feel confident enough to actually engage in the classics. And it is true. Like, old British working class culture was far more literate than a Cambridge or Oxford graduate today. I'm comfortable in saying that. I'm talking about myself. I mean, if you read some of the poetry that was written by people in between their clerk jobs, you know, in the turn of the 20th century, I could never do anything like that. It comes from truly wanting to better yourself, you know, being an autodidact, and I think we have lost that.
Specific example of that was the young Margaret Thatcher, Margaret Roberts, when she's a grocer's daughter, so she wasn't, you know, terribly poor, but she was not at all a grand, small town provincial. And she knew by heart for the whole of her life, because she learned reams and reams of poetry. So she could recite, and it used to in public as a schoolgirl, Tennyson, Kipling, Longfellow. And once Philip Larkin, the great modern poet, met her, and she said, "Oh, I love your poems, Mr. Larkin." And he, being a cussed old bastard, said, "Well, quote one then." And she did. And she recited one to him, and of course he loved her ever afterwards. But that a lot of that has been lost somehow. And by the way, it's to do with the decline of organized religion as well, because everybody used to know what was in the Bible and would recite lots of prayers and that sort of thing. So exalted thoughts and words are always put in your mind, almost no matter how poor you were.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And Suzanne, do you not think that? What do you think of this idea that a British culture of anti-intellectualism militates against class mobility?
Well, I was just thinking, one of the talking about low expectations, I would like to hear people say, you know, Camilla has just got 4 A stars, but she's going to do an apprenticeship, or she's going to do a vocational thing, or she's going to be a sex worker. You know, we never hear that, do we? What we hear is, you know, the aspiration is for, you know, the humanities degree or whatever. I think several education ministers have pushed apprenticeships. I don't think it's really taken off, but I think we're going to be forced into it by AI, because we are going to need the old manual skills. I mean, we have a shortage of builders right now, and will people get, you know, the whole dignity of labour thing, will that come back? We saw it very much during the pandemic, I think, about who we need and why we might need them. And I think that maybe slightly change some people's own relationship to the class that they feel themselves to be.
Yeah.
Yes. And James, can I turn to you and just ask you, I mean, do you think the new class system that you've outlined, do you think it's more porous? Is it easier to move from one category to another under that class system than it was under the more 1960s class barriers, for example?
Well, I think one of the things that we haven't yet talked about is how immigration has changed the class system.
Yes.
Dramatically. So, and again, so much of the way we think about class is very personal. So, a personal story. When I first moved to London, 25 years ago, as soon as I opened my voice, people could place me, because most of the people that I worked around were born in England, they'd grown up in England. As Charles Moore said, they have these ideas of jokes about the English class system. And people could automatically say, my accent softened over time, but they could automatically say, this guy from the East Midlands, state educated, etc. Now you operate in London. I was running a business here for 10 years. You'd go to clients that weren't born in Britain. They couldn't place you in the same way. So what was, some of it may have been a help, some of it may have been a hindrance, but those prejudices, for good or for ill, aren't there anymore. So the class system is very different. And the class system, really, in London and the big cities is different from the class system in predominantly white provincial England.
That's interesting. That's an interesting observation also. So you basically say there's basically parallels. The separate societies now, really, with a different class system.
Yeah. So the class system back home in the East Midlands is still somewhat reminiscent of the class system that we've been sort of talking in shorthand about and joking about. When you're in London, that's dramatically different. That's a long way around to saying that yes, I think that the class system, as we've characterised it in this via the class calculator, is more porous, because it doesn't judge people by sort of accent, if you like. It judges people a bit more by their sort of, to some extent, their material successes. Some of the cultural capital is obviously, it to some extent reflects economic success. If you're going to the opera, drinking fine wine and fancy whiskies, then that comes from one's wealth. So yes, I think it is a more porous system. And the final thing I would say about that is some of you may have seen the stuff that I write in the Telegraph about working class and lower middle class voters across England. And when you talked to them, until relatively recently, you would ask them what their aspirations were for their child. And typically they would say, my kid's not very academic, he's probably going to go off and get an apprenticeship at Rolls-Royce or at Bombardier, the train maker in Derby, and they do these sorts of jobs. They're not saying that so much anymore. They are now talking about their children going to university just because of the nature of the fact that the economy has changed. So I think in a lot of these places, they're being forced into the consideration of academic attainment, if you like, in a way that probably wasn't true recently, and are viewing university as a more, albeit an expensive route, a route sort of upwards, if you like. And that traditionally, in my experience, was mostly found amongst migrant families that were just obsessed with education. They came in with relatively little money. They saw education very obviously as a route up. That's starting to filter, I think, into provincial England.
I'm very interested in the question of how immigration has massively changed the British class system. And Michael, what's your thoughts on that? I mean, because if you go to the highest performing schools in Britain.
Yes, no. I think that is certainly it certainly has, and it's always dangerous when one gets into generalities about migration and how Britain has changed, because people think if you're talking in generalities, you're then stereotyping, and if you're stereotyping, then you're then being dismissive and racist and so on. However, I think it is the case. I saw it just yesterday when I visited a school in London and talked to the sixth form there and was asking the students which A-levels they'd chosen and which universities they hoped to go to. And it was striking that one of the students said, well, my parents are immigrants, so I'm studying STEM subjects. And all the other children sort of nodded. And it speaks partly to the point that James made, that students' parents would have had the expectation that many immigrants have, that whatever the sacrifices that they've made in order to come here, whatever the barriers that they faced, they want their son or daughter to be established as a professional. And the surest way of doing so is by having them study science subjects, because absolutely, still the case in Britain, the most respectable thing that you can be is a doctor. And that is, the absolute guarantee, you are automatically middle class. And those subjects also mean that whether or not you go on to accountancy, work in financial services, pursue another profession, they're the sort of 4x4 SUV subjects that can go anywhere. Whereas if you're studying your English, your history, your German, or whatever it might be, then the perception is, certainly amongst migrant families, that narrows your career option. What are you going to do? You're studying history, what are you going to do? Become a teacher? And so that has been a change. I think the other thing also is that amongst the groups that have come to Britain over the course of the last 100 years, different groups have brought with them, often depending on where they've come from within the host or home country, different attitudes. So it has often been the case that people who've come from Bangladesh or from Pakistan have come from poorer areas. So people who come here from Bangladesh have come from Sylhet, people who've come from Pakistan have come from Pakistani Kashmir, which are relatively poorer, and they've carried with them some of the attitudes of those areas. Whereas it's often the case that people who constitute the core of, for want of a better word, the Hindu middle class have obviously come from different parts of the subcontinent, and again have carried particular attitudes with them as well. And you can often find that within those communities there's an awareness of that, which for people outside those communities is sometimes lost.
Suzanne, what's your view of how immigration has upended the British class system?
I don't think it's upended it. I think it's changed it both at the top and the bottom, really. I hear what Michael's saying, particularly about where people come from and what their expectations are. I was working in a refugee centre voluntarily, and for instance, the Syrian people I work with were highly educated, and even though they'd seen some of the absolute worst stuff, you knew that they were going to make a life here. You had that feeling. But when I was with the Eritrean and Somalian people, you were just trying to get them through the day. And so I think it does depend on where people come from. And my experience of my three children through state education is there are certain communities, most communities value education and the STEM subjects exactly as Michael has spoken about. But for instance, where I live, there's a large Turkish Cypriot community, and the teachers were always trying to get the kids to stay on past 16 because they wanted their boys and their girls to go into the garment factories or the restaurants. And these are often very bright kids, and they had to be persuaded to stay on. The Turkish Cypriot community was sort of slightly stuck in the 50s when they came here. But if you're with particularly South Asian people, they are certainly pushing their kids right through. But the whole question of, the difficult question on migration, as we all know, on immigration, is this binary that has been set up between all white working class people and other people. I don't think that exists. I think the working class actually mixes more than any other class. So I think it's really complicated.
Charles, what's your thoughts on that?
Just a bit more on the point about class and immigration and education. I notice every year Eton gives out 15 scholarships to 13-year-old boys purely on academic merit, nothing else. And they publish the list. And I looked at last year, I think it was last year's list, So 15 boys, only 2 of them had British names. One of them had an Indian name, one of them had a continental European name, and all the others had Chinese names, including 3 boys called Wang. That's absolutely extraordinary change. And in many ways, it's to the good. But I think one of the things that's happening that's actually is bad in British universities is they're so driven by the search for money, and the funding system is such that they get far more money out of foreign students, I don't mean immigrants, but foreign students, than they do out of British ones. And that gives them an enormous temptation. So actually the Chinese regime has basically infiltrated the British university system, partly in order to spy on intellectual property, partly to advance propaganda, and partly because they, reasonably enough, want their people to be well educated. And actually that has been a very great disadvantage for the indigenous population of this country of any colour. And it's a real serious problem. Some universities have, particularly in their postgraduate courses, have more Chinese than all the other people put together as their students.
Poppy, what's your thoughts on the interaction between immigration and the class system?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd return to something you were saying, Suzanne, about it's important not just to look at the top, but to the bottom. And this is where, James Hill research shows that terms like working class are imperfect for modern Britain. Because often when we talk about working class, there's like a silent white working class. That would be the left behind group, part of the quiz. So they're older, they're living perhaps in the north of England or in the regions. They are not highly educated. They may have had manual or what you would call unskilled work. But they may be homeowners. They may have some degree of assets, even if they're not investing in stocks. Now, that group of people is pretty right-wing. It's swung pretty heavily towards the right in the last decade or so. It's the group that is being constantly discussed by politicians at elections. I mean, Morgan McSweeney's obsession was, how do we win these people back over? This was the dominating conversation during the Corbyn years in the Labour Party. And of course, it brought Boris Johnson his massive majority, the support of these people being lent. So that's one part of what you would call the old working class. There's a new working class that is materially much worse off. Have a much more precarious existence. And this is a group of people which will be much more ethically diverse. It will be younger. They'll be your delivery drivers. They might be casual workers. They will live predominantly in cities. This is a group of people that is actually moving towards the left. They are not organised in the way that you would consider like a traditional 19th or 20th century conception of class would be, but they are left-wing. And when we talk about the Zach Polanski and his Green Party, I think the stereotype is white, middle class, lefties with blue hair. That's certainly part of his base, but actually he's picking up these people, this precariat class, in massive numbers in a way that Jeremy Corbyn never really did. He is mobilising those people. So I think in that sort of way, it is really relevant. Immigration has kind of created a new group of people with its own distinct culture of voting patterns, even if it hasn't asserted itself yet in British politics. And I think in the years to come, this will become an important voting bloc. And I'll return to universities that you brought up, Charles. It's funny, when I was at university, and you might want to cover your ears here, Allister, I went to the Marxist Club a couple of times. And it was very small. There were about 3 guys there. They were all postgraduate students. And they were complaining that nobody wants to sign up for the Marxism Club anymore because everybody is way more interested in identity politics. So loads of people would turn up to different nationalities groups. The Feminist Society literally had people queuing out of the door. I mean, it was so popular in there. I don't know why. It was super boring. But that was how people were defining themselves. They were not really bringing up their class background unless they were trying to win an argument with someone in the pub. You were much more caught up in your identity. I would have conversations with people that I knew were the children of international royalty, but who would pretend that they would have some kind of oppression matrix that I was lording over them, petty bourgeois from Essex, as you put it at the beginning, Allister, on the basis of that identity, skin colour or background. And so I think maybe class is sometimes the wrong way of looking at it. I think the identity politics is in some ways a better way of determining a way that a person might vote, the sort of politics that attracts them, sort of people that they might hang out with. in a way that complicates the question that you couldn't necessarily do in the 19th century when you had about 19 different classes you could slot everyone into. It's much more unpredictable now.
But don't you think that the ultimate identity politics was leave and remain? I mean, when we talk about identity politics, everybody thinks it's race, gender, and stuff. But I think it was. I mean, I studied class. I edited the back half of Marxism Today, but I had no idea of class until I went to work for The Guardian. I mean, seriously. I mean, I understood it theoretically, but I just couldn't understand how everybody knew each other and shared flats with each other and had these connections. And it's this, I think it is changing because and I agree with Poppy about the internet isn't sort of a terrible thing. People can make connections now right across class. But younger people, I mean, my kids were, I'm sure all younger people, also don't make a distinction between the politics here and the politics in America, for instance. So you can get this sort of strange kind of coalitions going on.
I mean the Americanization of everything as a result of the internet, probably, is really weird. And it just leads to all sorts of strange...
But don't you also think you said about having more visual society?
Yes.
The Americanization, I wonder how many people of my age are more class conscious and more aware of the fact that they don't have that much money because they see like so much American influencer content and they go, their houses are massive,
but
they have a boat.
They already saw that in the 80s when they watched TV. I think what's changed now is that people have absorbed the entire political culture and history of America.
Yep.
And they build their own class identity on the American system, which is creating both certain upsides but also major problems.
Yeah. No, I think that's completely right. There's a very good book by a young writer called I think Tomiwa Owolade.
Who works for us. Yeah.
Exactly. Called "This Is Not America," making that point. But and I think probably for as long as I can remember, people have been lamenting the Americanization of Britain or European culture. But it's happening. And there are just two things. One is it is striking. My own children are 21 and just 23, and their knowledge of American politics and political commentary is as rich as their knowledge of British political commentary. So people like Nick Fuentes or Tucker Carlson or others are on screen and as accessible and as compelling, if not more compelling, than anyone in the UK political sphere, apart, of course, from the Spectator's own podcast, quite right. But the other thing also is, again, at the risk of going woof, I remember during COVID when we had the Black Lives Matters protests and the fact that there were all sorts of sensitive questions about policing them. And obviously George Floyd's death, like all deaths, was a tragedy, but it didn't happen in Britain. And yet it became a sort of global political event.
And people almost thought it happened in Britain. I mean, that's the thing. You had quite a few people who almost started to believe that these things were happening in Britain.
Oh, yeah, quite, exactly.
And I found that quite scary, but I also think it sort of changed the sort of culture. James, what do you think of that? What do you think of the sort of the Americanization of everything? How is that impacting class?
I think... Well, the Americanization of politics, I think, has happened amongst people interested in politics. You know, if you go back home, you are not hearing people talk in the same way as people perhaps do down here. But I thought it was interesting yesterday, Shabana Mahmood was doing this podcast that was quite widely reported, and she was criticizing someone for having criticized her at this podcast, and she suggested this person was just a white liberal or something, which not very long ago meant that you sort of were a follower of Asquith and Lloyd George and you believed in free trade, and it's all of a sudden now it means sort of lefty. So with this terminology is clearly creeping into the English lexicon.
Can I just raise a point we haven't talked about class really, which I think matters a great deal, is a massive, massive change in the status of women.
Yes.
Because essentially your class was until really very recently defined by your father more than anybody else. And you sort of took your class, and indeed the wife more or less took her class from the husband. I mean, not always in every case, obviously, and now that's really not true. And so that has made everything much more fluid, I think, in what James has been and how he analyzes things. And quite often you find families now where one person, and it could be equally pretty much either sex now, is doing quite a low-grade job, and the other is doing a very high-grade job. And it's all much more flexible. And basically, I think there has some certain difficulties, particularly about the upbringing of children in terms of time, but it's basically a good thing because it's made everything much less rigid. And you don't have to take your status from the labor of one man. And so almost all the definitions we're used to have profoundly shifted.
But there's also a slightly different argument, which is that in as much as meritocracy has progressed, the sort of new elites feel quite entitled about their success and feel they deserve their success 100% because it comes from their hard work and their IQ or whatever. And that probably creates all sorts of other problems and may well have helped create this new sort of upper caste in British politics, or this sort of ruling class concept, or this idea that you've got a class, you've got the sort of the Brexiteers versus the elites and all that sort of stuff. What's your thoughts on that, Michael? How much do you think meritocracy has destroyed itself effectively?
No, I think that's spot on, because the phrase meritocracy was originally invented by Michael Young, the father of the Spectator columnist and Telegraph writer Toby Young, and it was coined as a criticism. So when he used the phrase, it was not to say that meritocracy was a good thing, which is broadly how we use it now. It was to make precisely that point, that if you rise because you believe that it's your own unaided effort, then you take a sort of Estee Lauder view of yourself because you're worth it. And therefore, the idea that it is chance or good fortune that has elevated you to that position is moved to the back of your mind. And therefore, when you consider the plight of those who are less fortunate, you think that they're lazy or somehow morally worth less. And so that leads to a harder-hearted society. I was thinking earlier when you invited Charles to talk about the benefits, some of the benefits that existed in class systems. We talked about working class solidarity and culture and its value. There was, I think there still just is, and it's not an unmixed good, but there was a sense amongst the political elites in the 19th century. There was a sense of obligation. So I'm a great fan of the novels of Anthony Trollope. And one of the striking things there is that you get this sense of, yes, the heroes, they're not perfect heroes, like the Duke of Omnium, Plantagenet Palliser, are incredibly snobby, very worried about who their children might marry and who their children are involved with. But at the same time, even as they think about the aristocracy as an order, not just a class, an order, they also have a profound sense that with their wealth and status come certain obligations, not just to play a role in public service, but how they think about the nation is different from someone who thinks, well, I'm supremely gifted, it's my right to be in this position, and I don't have to think about how I'm going to be perceived by others, let alone posterity in that sense. So, as I say, I'm not arguing for the restoration of aristocratic privileges and moving back to the 19th century, though sometimes it might be nice. but you know, even as I think a more open society is a better one, we still lose something along the way.
Poppy, what about the divide between young and old? Do you think the emphasis on class that we're having today and so on, do you think the generational issue maybe matters more sometimes?
I think the thing that people in my particular age group, just from talking to my own friends, think about most.
People born in the 21st century.
Yeah, just by the skin of my teeth. The discussions that everyone seems to have at the moment is not that we have 6 different class groups, but there's two that really matter at this stage of life. Are your parents going to give you a down payment for a house, or are they not? Income, because they've been squeezed for so long, doesn't really mean that much, particularly if you're living in London and a third of your money every month goes on your rent. You're probably not renting somewhere pleasant. I'm certainly not. I've got a very nasty room that costs me over £1,000 a month to live in, and I'm lucky. And so for people like us, I think the obsession is with wealth. Wealth. How do you get assets? People that have assets, it's not fair. You know, the lesson that you've been told is if you do well in school, you'll get your good job. Well, suddenly you didn't get your good job, or you got your good job, but you're earning the same wage that someone did in 2007, and everything costs 10 times as much. And so you start looking around saying, hang on, why is it that this person just got lucky by accident of birth? That they will be able to get on the housing ladder, that they won't have to pay off their student loans because their parents paid for that immediately. So I think at the moment, the leftward turn amongst my generation, which is often kind of pathologized as like wokeness, and that's part of it. Part of it is just people want to be kind and they have a slightly misguided way of going about it. But there is an economic basis for this. Like millennials in particular are a downwardly mobile class that has false consciousness about its position in society, because it's not advocating for having lower taxes, for not having to pay for older people their pensions, not having to pay for the NHS that they barely use, not having to pay for the public services that they are not using yet either. It's actually to give more money to the state to expand, because they hope that one day they'll be able to get the social house, or they might get some of the handouts that other people in society seem to be getting. So there's this interesting phenomenon where, because everything is now justified in terms of assets and wealth, people have proletarianized. You know, the graduate class feel that they have been proletarianized, and they are, mobilizing in that way. So that I think is the real difference. For older people who are homeowners who have managed to gain assets, they will probably have a older view of the class system, one that perhaps is more dictated by your mannerisms, whether or not you turn the central heating on in your house all the time. I'm not sure, posh people always have cold houses.
Yes.
Whereas I think if you're younger now, it's much nastier, it's much crueler. You feel that there's this ever-shrinking pie, and you've got to fight very, very hard to try and get something out of that.
Charles?
Yes, I think that's all very important, and it's a real challenge for people with a small c conservative view of life about what to do, because if you cease to get satisfactory economic growth, people get into the idea, very understandably, they get into the idea, but which is in fact wrong, that wealth is just a lump. And if it is just a lump, it's very important how you divide it.
Yes.
Whereas in fact, and that's why they say tax the rich, but more. But actually, wealth isn't a lump. It's more like a yeast. It's a means by which everything continues to grow. And unfortunately, we've had so many policies that act against that, that the great majority of people who did feel in the 1980s that they could get on in the world, particularly in property ownership and setting up new businesses, now don't. And you could almost say, I'm sorry, I'm not making a party point here, I don't have a party, but right now you could say the government is target bombing people who want to start up a business or who have a small one. And it's not fulfilling its housing aims so that house prices won't fall and so on. And this is really serious, because it will make people justifiably angry, and they're probably jumping to the wrong conclusion about what. So they're demanding more government help, when actually, if they had more freedom, if they were given more freedom, they'd have more opportunity.
Basically, the problem is, for the first time since the Industrial Revolution, there's no economic growth, and there's no increase in GDP per capita in peacetime year after year after year after year. And that is a complete disaster for everything, and it entirely undermines our society and everything. Suzanne, what's your view on the sort of precariousness that's developing among younger people?
Well, I've got three. My life is a sort of sociological experiment, I think, because I've got a child who's 40, a child who's 30, and a child who's sort of 25. So I've sort of got, see how it's gone. I see how it's gone. And property is the issue. Housing is the issue. I think housing cuts across almost every aspect of the problems that we're talking about. And when I think there was a survey in one of the papers today about young people not wanting to fight for our country should there be a war. I totally understood it, because they are not invested. They feel the social contract as it was is broken. They do not feel that they can move on. you've got two-income families, both, one of my daughters, both she and her guy works, and they have two small children, and their childcare is massively expensive, and it is very, very, very difficult. So if we are to change anything, if we are to make any kind of equality, if you like, I mean, that's a very old-fashioned word, I know, but we really have to sort out property, we really have to sort out housing, and the new kind of rental rights that people are saying is actually going to depress the housing market. I mean, again, it's very complicated, but if I could do one thing, I would, I would build houses and I would give them to Poppy's generation.
Michael, you certainly undoubtedly agree with building houses, but do you think it's all about the economy ultimately? Do you think it's all about the economy?
I don't think it's all about the economy, but I think that it is a major part. I think you're right that both, and in a way, talking to you, Allister, about the economy, I mean, I feel as though I'm going back to university, and I'm the undergraduate, and you're the professor. So please correct me if I'm wrong, because one of the things I was going to say is it's not just the case that we've had for nearly 2 decades almost no growth and very few productivity gains. And it's not just that it's going to hit young people even harder because of the advent of artificial intelligence. It's also the case that the salve that was applied post the financial crisis of lower interest rates and printing more money meant that those who had assets, those who had homes, benefited even more, and then the failure to build more homes overall has only exacerbated it. So it's almost as though all of these things together, combined with the usurious interest rate that we now charge for student loans, is almost as though you had some evil genius, some Dr. Evil crooking his little finger and thinking, how can I ensure that the last 2 decades are designed to make Poppy's generation as angry as possible?
If I could quickly pull up, because you mentioned AI. This is another situation where there's only 2 classes that matter. If you speak to some of the people who are working on these frontier models about their vision of the world when we reach AGI, general artificial intelligence that's smarter than any human being could possibly be, they will say to you that there will be a permanent underclass, which will be, 98% of the population, and 2% with ultra-concentrated wealth who lord over the rest of us. Now, I don't believe this, to be clear. Otherwise, I would be outside with a pitchfork trying to find out where they live. But I do agree that the UK is in a uniquely precarious position if even 1/10 of the claims of this technology are correct. We are a services-based economy. We do not have a manufacturing centre. It's a bit of a fallacy to say that we lost it in the 1980s. We actually lost it under New Labour, and partly through the work of Ed Miliband. We have the most expensive industrial energy costs in the developed world. That's one of the reasons why we can't run factories here. We can't even build data centres that the government keeps talking about. It's one of their few achievements, along with breakfast clubs. So I think that will also become another dividing issue between young people and old. If the only thing that will matter in the future is holding assets and income no longer matters anymore, what will you do with these people? They will not just sit around and do nothing. They will get angrier and angrier and angrier.
On which note, I'm going to ask the panel some of the questions that the audience has submitted. If perhaps you could just give me relatively short answers. The first question, there's many questions here, so I'm going to just read out a few, but here's a question from Anonymous, of whom there seem to be quite a few in the audience. Do you agree that there are only 2 classes, the bubble and the rest? James?
The bubble and the rest?
Yeah, the 2 classes,
yes,
the bubble and the
I
rest.
think there is definitely, that's obviously a slightly flippant comment, but one that I'm very attracted to. In that I think, yes, there are these, as we discussed before, sort of parallel class systems. There is sort of London and big city class system, which is highly porous and it's more meritocratic, if you like. There is the world outside the bubble, which is a bit more like the class system that we grew up with. So yes, there is something to that.
Michael, what's your thought?
Broadly, yes. And then another writer, David Goodhart, made this distinction. I don't know, it's quite the same, but somewheres and anywheres. So people who, it's not just the case that their skills and their credentials and their connections mean that they can work anywhere. There are also people who don't have the same sense of identification with the country. And so, yes, there is that distinction. An internationalist, globalist, if you can use that word, elite, and the rest.
I think the point you made about readiness to fight for your country, and I think what was better in the past was that whatever class you were, you had a pretty strong idea of your country and a natural patriotism. And I think there now is a class of person who feels they can rise right above that and go anywhere, do anything, and if there's trouble in one country, get on a plane and go to another. And that's not good for social solidarity or indeed for defending ourselves.
I'm going to ask another question. Another person called Anonymous says, Michael Gove said that doctors are the most respected people in the country. Does this actually stand today? What do you think, Susan?
Well, they have been trying very hard to lose that luster in recent months. And it may reflect my own background and my own assumptions. But I still think it's the case. And it'd be interesting to know what the audience think. That it's hard to imagine a greater sense of delight in a parent's breast than knowing that their child can become a doctor.
Suzanne, what's your view on that? Do you think doctors remain the most respected single profession?
Yes, I think they may well be. We all know who's at the bottom. It was the estate agents and journalists, isn't it?
Yeah, property writers are in trouble in that case.
Just, Allister, there was a funny joke about journalism, which was, it wasn't that long ago that Superman's day job was a journalist. And how far they've plummeted in the public minds.
Yeah, thank you, James. A question from Alex. Would the panel, and that's quite a Telegraph question actually, would the panel agree that there are essentially two classes in modern Britain, namely those who are net tax consumers and those who are net taxpayers? Poppy?
I mean, I quite like the answer to this one because I always think when you try and oversimplify it to like two different groups, you'll get too caught up in it. But as someone who is a net contributor, at least now that I'm working, yeah, I do think so. I think I read a newspaper article about how the group of people who are taking more out of the system is larger than it's ever been, or at least ever been in the modern era in this country. And I think a lot of anger in politics at the moment, particularly at the right, is, and perhaps it's a symptom of the fact that we're not growing the pie big enough, so we're kind of scrabbling for what we have with the state resources, is people looking at things like social housing, discounted tickets to Hampton Court Palace, whether or not you get like a special badge that lets you cut in the queue for places, and they go, hang on, that's not fair. I'm working hard. Life is getting increasingly difficult for me. I've had to cancel my holiday this year. And yet for you, you're always being protected by the government. You know, you're going to get support on your winter fuel payments. You're going to get your energy bills topped up. I have to continue paying. So I think this isn't particularly new. This is definitely a case when the Conservatives first came back in power, the austerity drive. But it is definitely animating politics at the moment.
A question from Raymond. A question for Lord Moore. By the way, I thoroughly enjoyed your Thatcher biography, he says. Do you think the preponderance of PP graduates, old Etonians and Wickhamists who governed the UK between 2010 and 2024 did the UK proud?
One thing I did in my Thatcher book was whenever I had a character that I named who was an MP, I always put a little biographical note about them at the bottom of the page, and I always put which school they went to, because it was very, very striking that they only, and particularly Tories, had, among whom Mrs. Thatcher moved, they only went to about 4 schools. I mean, to the most incredible degree, which showed how remarkable it was that Mrs. Thatcher had got through all that. I come back to the point that I was making earlier, which is that ought to have changed. If we'd had a more quality-based education, that should have changed by now, so that the independent schools would, to a large extent, have been out-competed by the great mass of people who go to state schools, but the state schools have been so bad that they haven't.
But
And so
basically,
then-
the entire Labour cabinet seems to be from state schools, I think.
Yes.
They're very low quality.
Yes,
But they're not exactly the highest
but
quality.
they, I mean, without wishing to be rude, they don't seem very well educated.
But that's interesting. But Michael, what's your thought on that? Is that net a good thing or a bad thing that the entire Labour cabinet hails from state schools?
I think the danger is that they think, or some of them think, that because of that, that they remain wholly in touch. So Ed Miliband was educated in a state school, but the primary that he went to was the same primary as Boris Johnson's in Islington. And when you have Professor Ralph Miliband, Britain's leading Marxist academic, as your dad, then you understand about class, but you're not a member of the class. So in a way, the danger is that when that boast is made, it encompasses everything from Ed Miliband, who was born into the intellectual aristocracy, Keir Starmer, who rose, to become a professional, and Angela Rayner, who worked as a care worker and left school at 16, and all state educated, but actually all different experiences of the class system.
Very interesting. So I think we're almost out of time now, last few minutes. So I'm going to have to draw this to a close shortly. Before that, I will ask the panelists very briefly, maybe just with a couple of sentences, to give your verdict on the original question we asked ourselves tonight. So I'll come to each of you in turn. Does class still rule Britain, James?
I think that it does, but in a very different way than it previously did.
Right. Okay. Still does, but completely different. Michael?
Yes.
I like that. Suzanne?
Yes.
Charles?
Yes, but.
Ah, yes. Very good. Bobby?
Yes, but it's going to get much worse.
What's going to get much worse?
The class divides in this country.
Oh, right, yes. Well, that's a good set of answers, I will say. Now, I'm going to turn to you, the audience, both in the room and also in our live stream. I'm going to ask you whether your mind has been changed at all, whether you still think what you thought at the beginning. Do you think class still rules Britain? Please can I ask you to vote again in our live poll via the QR code displayed now behind me. Can't quite remember what the answer was last time. It was something
It was
like
62.
Yes,
62.
So let's see. But the panel is pretty unanimous in its devastating verdict.
No, too much agreement.
Wow, look at that. Going down? No, going down, yeah. Oh, going up. I love this sort of live statistical
I can't see it.
display.
74 has gone up.
Yeah, it's gone up. It's gone up quite significantly. Well, that sort of looks like a new equilibrium to me. 3/4 now believe that class still rules Britain, which is up quite significantly as a result of our discussion. So I think this concludes the discussion for the evening. Thank you so much to all our audience, both in the room and on the live stream, for joining us tonight and for sharing your questions and views across the evening. But above all, thank you to all our panelists for their insight and good-natured debate. Please join me in thanking them now. Thank you. Very good.
Thank you.
Thanks very much and good night. Thank you.